Washington keeps announcing how many targets it destroyed. Tehran isn't counting targets at all, it's counting days. And only one of those two numbers actually decides who wins this war. I want you to hold on to that distinction for the next 30 minutes, okay? Because right now, if you're only watching the press briefings, you'd think this war has an obvious winner. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stood at a Pentagon podium in early April and laid out the numbers like a scoreboard. More than 13,000 targets struck. Roughly 80% of Iran's air defenses destroyed. Senior commanders eliminated, all inside the opening weeks of Operation Epic Fury. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth mocked the very idea that this could be called a quagmire. Financial analysts like Charles Myers went on record saying Iran had no path but defeat, that the back of Tehran's military machine had been broken. And yet, months later, that same Iran is still standing, still firing missiles, still shutting down the Strait of Hormuz whenever it decides to, and Trump himself, according to reporting in Foreign Affairs, has publicly complained that a battered Iran still refuses to, in his own words, cry uncle. A country that supposedly had its military machine broken in the opening days is somehow still dictating the tempo of a war against the two most technologically advanced militaries on the planet, months later. So here's the question worth actually sitting with. What if Iran was never trying to win this war? In the conventional sense at all? What if the entire Iranian strategy was built from day one around a completely different goal, not defeating America's military, but trapping America inside a war it can never cleanly finish? Today, I'm going to walk through three competing explanations for why this conflict refuses to end the way Washington's own scoreboard suggests it should have ended months ago. I'm going to use nothing but on-record analysis from Foreign Affairs, the Council on Foreign Relations, CSIS, and named Middle East strategy experts like Vali Nasser and Lawrence Friedman. And then I'm going to show you why the real explanation isn't America is winning, and it isn't Iran is losing either. It's that both sides may be using two completely different definitions of victory. And only one of those definitions has ever mattered for who actually walks away in control of how this ends. Three theories, same 18-month conflict. Only one framework explains all of it. Are you ready? Let's go. Before I get into the evidence, you need the three theories by name, because if you don't understand the categories, you can't judge the evidence properly, okay? Theory number one is what I'll call the decisive victory theory. This is the Pentagon's own framing, and it's not baseless. It says American and Israeli air power has degraded Iran so severely, so quickly, that whatever fighting continues now is just the death throes of a defeated regime managing its own collapse. Theory number two is what I'll call the stalemate theory. This says neither side has actually won anything, that this is simply a messy, inconclusive conflict with no clear resolution, the kind of muddled outcome you get whenever two sides fight past their original objectives, without a plan for what victory even looks like. And theory number three, the one I'm going to build for you today, I call the exhaustion trap. This says Iran deliberately designed its entire military posture around a single insight, that America cannot politically sustain an open-ended war, and that every missile Iran fires, every strait closure, every refusal to formally surrender, is specifically engineered to convert a war Iran cannot win militarily into a war America cannot afford to keep fighting. Let's take them one at a time. Theory one, the decisive victory. I want to be fair to this theory because the raw numbers behind it are genuinely staggering and I don't want to wave them away. Here's the strongest version of the case. According to Central Command's own figures, the United States struck over 1,000 targets inside Iran within the first 24 hours of the war, and more than 5,000 within the first 10 days, enabled by a system called Maven Smart, built by Palantir, which integrates AI models drawing on nearly 180 classified data sources to generate targeting decisions at a scale and speed no human command structure could match on its own. By the time the first ceasefire took hold in April, General Kane's own count put total strikes above 13,000, with roughly 80% of Iran's air defense network destroyed and senior military and nuclear figures eliminated. Charles Myers, a senior research fellow at Signum Global Advisors known for his influence in financial circles, argued directly that this conflict was never a war of attrition to begin with, insisting Iran, facing the combined weight of the world's two most advanced militaries, had no realistic path except defeat. Other voices, like Behnam Ben Taleblu at the Foundation for Defensive Democracies, went further, warning that the only real danger was stopping too early, arguing that true victory meant making sure Tehran could never return to its prior posture. By any conventional military assessment, based on targets hit, defensive systems disabled, and key leadership impacted, this appears to be a campaign that should have produced a clear and decisive outcome. This is not a fringe perspective. It reflects the view of experienced analysts and senior defense officials who are basing their conclusions on available data. But here's the issue, and this is the most important question in this entire video, so focus closely on this part. If Iran's military capability was truly weakened in the opening phase of this conflict, then why, according to major international reporting, is there still frustration that Iran has not backed down even months after that supposed turning point? Think about that for a moment. A fully defeated opponent doesn't need to be pressured to concede. Defeated sides typically agree to terms, accept formal outcomes, or lose control of their governing structure. None of that has happened here. The fact that Iran has not formally stepped back despite sustained pressure suggests that the idea of a decisive outcome does not fully align with what we are actually seeing unfold, even months later. Theory 2, the stalemate. This is where things become more complex. Before presenting a final interpretation, it's important to consider this middle ground view because many credible analysts arrive at this conclusion. According to Lawrence Friedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London, writing in International Policy Analysis, Iran may not have matched the scale of actions taken by its adversaries, but in terms of political objectives, its strategy was still effective. The system remained operational, responses continued, and a significant global economic concern emerged around the Strait of Hormuz. At the same time, larger powers were not aiming for a prolonged ground engagement or full regime change. Within those limits, Iran's actions were sufficient to create what some analysts describe as a strategic balance between unequal forces. This tension was also visible in political discussions. In late April, a U.S. lawmaker described the situation as deeply problematic on both political and economic levels. Meanwhile, defense leadership strongly rejected that view, arguing the situation did not fit that characterization and warning against narratives that could benefit opposing sides. This isn't just outside analysis, it reflects a real divide within decision-making circles on how to interpret the outcome and whether a clear resolution even exists. And the pattern has continued well past that April hearing. In the days around July 7th through 9th, after Trump publicly declared the ceasefire over following renewed tanker attacks, the United States struck nearly 200 sites across Iran in 2 days, and Iran responded by firing missiles at American military bases in Jordan, Qatar, and Kuwait. The Strait of Hormuz went, in the New Republic's own words, all but closed. And yet, a senior Trump official told the Wall Street Journal directly that the United States still considered the ceasefire to be in effect, even while missiles were actively flying into 5 separate Iranian provinces. Another official put it even more bluntly to Axios, saying the goal was simply to, in his words, slap them a bit so they understand we're not fucking around. That's not victory language. That's not defeat language either. That's the language of two sides that have both quietly given up on a clean, formal ending and settled instead into a pattern of periodic violence. Neither side is willing to call a real war, and neither side is willing to call peace. If you stop your analysis here, the stalemate theory looks like the safest, most defensible conclusion. Nobody's winning. Nobody's losing. It's just messy and ongoing. The data, what the actual pattern looks like. Now let me give you the granular sequence, because theory without data is just storytelling, and I want you to see exactly why the stalemate framing, while reasonable, still misses something important. The war began on February 28th with combined U.S.-Israeli strikes. Operation Epic Fury's opening phase produced the eye-popping numbers already covered, over 13,000 targets, 80% of air defenses gone by the time a 2-week ceasefire took hold on April 7th and 8th. That ceasefire held roughly, imperfectly, for weeks, while negotiations continued. By mid-June, a formal memorandum of understanding was signed in Islamabad, establishing a 60-day window to work out the harder details, sanctions relief, the nuclear file, the administration of the Strait. Then, in the first week of July, tensions reignited. Iran's Revolutionary Guard struck commercial tankers in the Strait of Hormuz on July 6th and 7th. Trump, at the NATO summit in Ankara on July 8th, declared the ceasefire over. Within hours, the U.S. launched a fresh round of strikes, ultimately covering nearly 200 sites across Iran. Over the following 2 days, according to Iranian state media reporting 14 people killed. Iran responded within that same window by firing on U.S. military positions in Jordan, Qatar, and Kuwait, a broader set of targets than any single round of retaliation since the April ceasefire began. A senior official described this specific exchange to the Wall Street Journal as 4 to 5 times more extensive than any previous actions since the original agreement, while simultaneously insisting the underlying ceasefire framework technically remained in effect. Notice the shape of that pattern. It isn't a conflict restarting from zero, and it isn't a conflict ending either. It's a situation that flares, cools, flares again, on a rhythm dictated less by any formal declaration and more by whichever side currently needs to demonstrate resolve to its own domestic audience. CSIS's own tracking confirms the financial dimension of this endlessness. Roughly 1/3 of the Trump administration's $87.6 billion supplemental budget request is now tied directly to costs generated by this situation, an ongoing, recurring line item, not a one-time expense tied to a finished campaign. Emily Harding and Cynthia Cook's CSIS analysis separately notes that Iran's ability to reconstitute its defense capacity now depends specifically on its capacity to import materials and equipment, meaning even the 80% of air defense's disabled figure isn't necessarily permanent. It's a number that can rebuild over time as long as Iran retains any functioning supply lines at all. Theory 3, the exhaustion trap. Now let me put it all together, because this is where the real explanation lives, and it requires understanding something Vali Nasr, professor of Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins, says, and author of Iran's Grand Strategy, laid out directly on public radio back in March. Nasr explained that Iran adopted this exact strategy deliberately after watching the United States enter Iraq. Tehran saw firsthand how a conventional Iraqi army, facing the U.S. on America's preferred terms, fell apart almost immediately, and Iran drew a specific lesson from that collapse, fearing it might be targeted next. So Iran began using indirect tactics against American forces inside Iraq instead, and, according to Nasr, it worked. The U.S. got stuck in a prolonged deadlock there and never seriously moved to enter Iran afterward. Nasr's core insight is this: America's defense system is built around air power, armor, and rapid, decisive outcomes. And critically, it does not have the domestic political stamina for a long, costly conflict. Iran understands that limitation precisely and has built its entire strategic approach around leveraging it. Rather than fighting the U.S. and Israel on the terrain where they're strongest, open conventional battle, Iran absorbs the initial punch, survives it, and then deliberately drags the conflict out for as long as possible because time itself is the weapon, not any specific missile or air defense system. This is exactly what Foreign Affairs' own separate analysis, titled directly "Iran Embraces a Forever War," documents about Tehran's diplomatic behavior specifically. Regime officials increasingly believe that past attempts at compromise were punished, not rewarded, noting that both the June 2025 and February 2026 attacks came in the middle of active negotiations, which convinced many inside Iran's leadership that outreach itself gets read by Washington as weakness rather than good faith. So Tehran has reoriented its entire approach to diplomacy, negotiate just enough to look reasonable to the rest of the world and reduce international pressure, but never concede anything that would reduce actual leverage, effectively mirroring what Iranian officials perceive as Washington's own negotiating posture back at it. And this is precisely why the 80% of air defenses destroyed statistic, however true on the day it was measured, was never actually the metric that determines who wins this specific kind of war. As Gufrani Dami's analysis in Small Wars Journal points out, quoting Henry Kissinger's famous observation about Vietnam, the guerrilla wins simply by not losing, while the conventional army loses simply by not winning outright. Every precisely targeted decapitation strike that removes an Iranian commander gets met with a replacement and an adaptation. The same pattern Israel has run since assassinating scientists working for Egypt's missile program back in the 1960s, all the way through Hamas and Hezbollah leadership, with lethality increasing every decade while the underlying strategic outcome stays frustratingly unresolved. The problem was never precision. The problem is that Washington keeps measuring success using a conventional scoreboard, targets struck, leadership eliminated, air defenses degraded, in a conflict where Iran isn't playing by that scoreboard at all. That's the exhaustion trap. Iran cannot defeat the US and Israeli air forces in open battle, and it isn't trying to. What it's actually doing is converting every American operation, no matter how tactically successful, into one more data point supporting a single simple message aimed not at Iran's own military, but at the American public and Congress. This war has no visible finish line. It costs billions of dollars every month, and it will keep costing that money indefinitely unless Washington eventually decides on its own that finishing the job isn't worth the political price of staying. The New Republic's own reporting captures exactly what that endgame looks like in practice already. A war that continues indefinitely through periodic bursts of violence, convenient whenever it suits Iran's regional interests or Washington's own domestic political needs, until, in their own words, it becomes someone else's problem, precisely the fate that befell Iraq and Afghanistan before it. 3 things to watch for in the next 30 days. All right, we're almost at the end, and I want to give you 3 specific things to track, because this is how you test a theory like this. You make predictions and see if the evidence matches. Prediction number 1. Watch whether the pattern of ceasefire technically still in effect, despite active strikes, continues to repeat. If the exhaustion trap theory holds, expect both sides to keep avoiding any formal declaration that the war has either ended or fully restarted, because neither side benefits from a clean, legible resolution that forces a real decision. Prediction number 2. Watch the actual dollar figures in future U.S. budget requests tied to this conflict. If Iran's strategy is working the way Nasser describes, expect that supplemental spending line to keep growing month over month, becoming an increasingly visible political liability for the administration, regardless of how many additional targets get struck. Prediction number 3. Watch whether Congress starts framing this war using explicitly Iraq and Afghanistan-style language. Quagmire, forever war, no clear exit, with increasing frequency, the way Garamendi already did in April. If that rhetoric spreads beyond a handful of critics into a broader bipartisan concern, that's the clearest sign. The exhaustion strategy is achieving its actual intended target: American domestic political patience, not Iranian air defenses. Here's your homework, and I mean this seriously. I want you to go find General Kane's actual April press briefing with the 13,000 target figure, and then go find the most recent reporting on strikes from just this past week. Compare the language each side uses to describe success. Ask yourself honestly whether either side's own rhetoric, months apart, sounds like a war moving toward resolution or a war settling into a permanent self-sustaining rhythm. If you find something that contradicts what I've laid out today, come argue with me in the comments. I mean that. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to look at the same numbers and ask a harder question. Then who's winning militarily? The question worth asking is this: when one side measures success in targets destroyed and the other side measures success in months survived, who actually gets to decide when this war is over? The side with more advanced weapons, or the side willing to simply keep existing until the other side's patience runs out first? Sit with that question. Look at the pattern we covered today, the April numbers, the July flare-up, the still technically a ceasefire language, the growing budget line, and I think you'll start to notice something the press briefings were never built to show you. I'll see you in the next one.